So we're going to shift kind of focus and tone here a little bit, and really talk about how to think about the qualitative factors that impact business continuity, and business risk, how to think geopolitically, and then ways of integrating that into other risk patterns and risk identification and mitigation that you may already have in play. I want to begin with a really basic sentence that defines why I think geopolitical analysis matters tremendously in all that we do. And this goes back to Halford Mackinder, one of the core geopolitical thinkers for the US and European or US and British style geopolitics. And that is, there is in nature no such thing as equality of opportunity for nations. One of the things that we always have to remember is that the world is unfair, it is uneven, it is unequal, and while we may have moral ideas that every individual matters the same, the reality is that geography is not fair. And that's what drives trade. That's what creates space for competition. That's what increases or decreases risk in certain areas. As technology changes, it can change the relative value of particular places. But the reality is that things are different all over the place. And so when we think geopolitically, we're always thinking not in terms of ideology necessarily or of what we wish, but trying to understand and think from the perspective of what is. And so I want to begin with an argument that we have moved back into a very normal pattern of the world, and that is a pattern with a multipolar global system. If we think about much of the integrated world, basically from about the 1500s on, when the world first starts to fully integrate as a global system, the norm for almost that entire period of time was that there was no single center of power and there was no clear bilateral center of competing power, even if for brief moments it may have appeared that way. The variation on that comes in the Cold War, where the world splits into two bipolar blocks, and then the immediate post-Cold War, where there was a perception that the United States was the single dominant power. And that imbalance in the global system actually drove a lot of perceptions of that overdominance, both of the United States and of what I would refer to as the North Atlantic-centric norms and standards that are currently considered to be the pattern and the path of the world. That's breaking now. We're back into a multipolar system. I argue it's multipolar and not bipolar. Europe and the United States are not fully aligned. China and Russia are clearly not fully aligned. There's not a democratic maritime bloc and a continental autocratic bloc, although we will often hear of those talked about. In reality, there are multiple centers of power. There's a lot of global integration, and that means it's a more complex world to think about. There's a lot more fluidity, a lot more flexibility. The North Atlantic norms that have been perceived as the path towards which the entire globe is moving in that sense of unity of trade patterns, of the idea of Western style democracy as the main correct type of government, the idea of Western styles of free trade as being the standard of the world, that's starting to break. And that's because as you think about the expansion of economic power internationally from that concentrated North Atlantic area to what we have today, many of the countries in the world were not part of that same historical philosophy of the United States and Europe, and therefore their views on the fundamental relationships between the state, industry, and people is very different than the core views in that North Atlantic consensus. And therefore we're seeing a pushback, and with power, economic power spread, and now we're seeing military power, information power being spread, that pushback is happening. So if we begin with this assertion that we are moving back, or that we are already back into that multipolar system, we can start to think about what that means. Again, it means that it's not going to be the bipolarism of the Cold War. The economic connectivity is too tight to allow a complete decoupling of the international system. And the way in which, say, the United States and the Europeans are evolving in their thoughts of what are the fundamentals of global regulation, they're different. Where they put their core priorities, clearly the United States is both an Atlantic and a Pacific power. is focusing very heavily now on the Pacific theater and has been trying to shift focus there for a long time. Europe is much more dominantly focused on the Atlantic theater, and particularly the continent of Eurasia. The Russians obviously have a westward focus. The Chinese have an eastward focus and a westward focus. And so we see very different systems. Dominant within that, the United States and China are clearly the two largest power centers. But Russia and Europe, whether we consider it the European Union or whether we consider other variations of thinking about Europe as an entity, have their own assertion of power. Europe traditionally, in the past 10, 15, 20 years, has been a driver of global regulation because Europe worked together and became the single largest single market. As such, changing regulations inside Europe required anybody who wanted to engage with Europe to have to change their regulations to engage with Europe. The United States was the single largest security power in the world. China was not the biggest economic power, but it was certainly at the center of global economic supply chains and trade. And those elements of power are still there, but that's starting to fracture and fragment. So what do we think about when we think about a multipolar world? We think about competition. We think about a lot of hedging, a lot of countries that in a Cold War would have to pick sides and have a economic, political, and security single relationship. Today, that's not the case. They can be economically aligned with one power, security aligned with another, and have a political alignment with a totally different power. So there's more fluidity in the relationships that we see. We see global norms, standards, and global governance start to be challenged, whether through competition, competing standards, competing norms, or through trying to erode some of that assertion of Western philosophy as dominating and move it to other types. We're seeing a return of simple things like protectionism, even in the West. So trade protectionism, the integration of economic security back into the concepts of hard security, that is going to be shaping the way we have to think about access to supply chains, access to suppliers, access to markets. We see expanded social and ESG pressures. These go up and down, and they have different powers and different forces and different geographies. And sometimes even within individual countries, it may be that a coastal area or an urban area may view things in one way and a rural area may view things differently. And that plays into domestic politics and the cycles of domestic politics that can have an impact on regulations that are going to trickle back into international trade. So at its core, well, we usually like to talk about war and competition and all of those things. Geopolitical impacts are more often than not really about what are the official and unofficial regulatory dynamics that impact the flow of ideas, capital, and goods across borders and either enable it or constrain it. And that's ultimately what we're looking at a lot of. If we think about global trade and global trade arrangements and global trade agreements, we have moved from that peak period during the just immediately following the post-Cold War, where there was a mass of new global trade agreements, and global trade agreements drew much more and much more complicated and far beyond concepts of trade, back to an idea where trade agreements are going to be shorter time frame, smaller focus, more focused on trade, and greater ability to change and adjust. You can think about a NAFTA that was created before the iPhone. It was not adaptable to changes in the way in which key components and things moved across borders. It was built in a very different era. So we're going to see a lot more minilateral, bilateral trade arrangements, smaller focus, smaller scale, smaller scope, more protectionism allowed within them, but again, less of the focus on the giant things like WTO or CPTPP or any of these types of trade arrangements. And we're seeing in the global financial architecture clear competition to the Western ideas. The Chinese have some of their own, particularly in the Pacific, the AIIB. We see the NDB forming up. So these alternative finances often come with fewer political requirements and therefore may be more appealing for certain countries. And at times, the politics behind them may allow them to go into places that are less cost effective. So the very nature of democracies, which make them strong, also create constraints on their ability, for example, to use geoeconomic tools internationally, aside from very clunky hard tools like sanctions or access to SWIFT or things of that sort. Um, they're finding it much more difficult to utilize positivist forms, driving and directing investment, because the private companies have a lot of freedom of their own choice, and they're not necessarily following what their government might like to see. Whereas in the less democratic countries, the integration between the government interest and the corporate interest can be much closer, and therefore it can be more effective towards state policy and appear, at least initially, to be a more positive rather than a more negative tool in shaping influence and shaping where things go. That said, it also means that it can be much more less reliable. So the Chinese, as we saw with Belt and Road, surged a whole bunch of money, and then a bunch of other money followed, and Chinese companies at the central and then the provincial and then the local level followed out, each with less and less concept of how the international system actually worked, and created all sorts of challenges, all sorts of problems. As China refocuses its interests internationally, that money may slow down to certain places and suddenly be refocused in other places, and countries that had easy access may find themselves losing access. So that gives us a framework, a frame of reference of how to think about multipolarity. Don't worry that we're rushing through this really quick. I believe you get the slides later anyway. So I want to go and talk about how do we think geopolitically and how do we use geopolitical thinking to try to understand the world system. One first step is to build models or frameworks, build geopolitical frameworks of countries, of regions, of areas within countries. Try to understand them from the bottom up. Let them explain themselves. Not how would I like to see them be, but how are they? What are the forces that are shaping and driving those? And what are the long-term dynamics outside of the current news cycle that have a very deep long-term impact? So if you're familiar with things like pest analysis, pestle analysis, in geopolitics, we basically use a 7-pillar framework for doing the same thing, but looking at countries from the bottom up. And we always start with geography. How does geography create opportunity and challenges for a particular place? That may be the size of the country, its location. Is it landlocked? What are the resources available? Where is population concentrated? And then we're going to look at politics, economic security. We're going to think about society and societal structures. We'll look at history, not only for the way in which things may have evolved over time, but how is history perceived and how does it shape the way in which society views itself? You can watch through time, and society's views of their own history change over time. History is not static. History is something that often more reflects now than it does the past, particularly in the way in which it's seen. And then we'll look at technology. And technology, I would argue, is the way in which humanity interacts with geography. From the very simplest technology, you think about the hunter-gatherer who could not access certain resources because shoes were not invented. And then they invented sandals and could now access new resources. Technology, from the very simplest up to the most complex, changes our relationship with geography. But it doesn't eliminate geography. It modifies the cost that geography imposes. It creates new opportunities from geography, but geography continues to weigh on the way in which societies and nations act and develop. So if we think about China and we think about 1.2, 1.3 billion people, massive amount of people, continent the size of the United States, yet if we look at a map, China is actually a very concentrated population. It's all squeezed primarily between two rivers in the northeast. And then there's a southern China down below the mountains, and there's this blob in central China, which is the Sichuan Basin. And that's China. Western China, you can go through Chinese history and over, and everybody is trying to move population to Western China, and it doesn't work. And it doesn't work because west of that population line, there's less than 10 inches of rain a year. And North of that population line that you see, there's less than 10 inches of rain a year. And therefore, there are geographic constraints to evening out China's population across a much broader geography. There are also other dynamics. The Tibetan plateau is particularly high. You have desert spaces, things of that sort. But geography continues to exert an influence on China, even if we say technology should mitigate those geographic dynamics. So we can look at a China and we can think about those dynamics. How do they continue to play? How do we think about the way in which that concentration of population shapes China's options? Then we can look and say, for much of Chinese history, and you can look back, China was not dependent upon the world. So Chinese trade was often local trade. When they were trading in early trading systems through the Silk Road or with the British trade, often it was in frivolities or extras that were produced simply to export. Why did the Opium Wars start? Why were the British facilitating the movement of opium into China? Because China didn't need anything from the British, and they were just taking all their silver. And so the British were trying to create a demand from China. So China has been able to largely isolate itself throughout history from global trade, even if it was interacting with global trade. And you could see that too in dig the Grand Canal to move the salt trade inland. When the pirates from the east come, the Chinese would just take their coastal populations and move them inland and starve out piracy. They weren't heavily dependent. Zheng He's fleet may have discovered America, but it didn't matter because they burned it. It wasn't significant. But in the early 2000s, 2010s, China, during their rapid growth, economic growth, had a fundamental break. And that break was China is now heavily dependent upon the international system. And when we think about that economic dynamic, that creates a huge vulnerability for China. Because if China is heavily dependent upon the international system and the international system is dependent upon maritime trade, and China has not developed up until that point a very strong maritime capacity and strength, and the United States is a huge maritime power dominating the seas and effectively encircling the Chinese coast through alliances and partnerships, then China was heavily vulnerable to US trade interdiction if the US chose to do so. And what does China do? We see the emergence of two strategies. The Belt and Road, which creates multiple diverse pathways for China to diversify its trade and reduce vulnerability to its maritime frontier. And we see the rapid expansion of Chinese naval capacity, missile capacity, anti-ship missile capacity, military capacity in the East China Sea to defend and secure what it sees as its inland sea, its Caribbean. And so by building these frameworks, we can identify stresses that may be on China that are beyond the individual moments of leadership, that individual leadership will have to look at and assess and understand and decide how to act on. But those frames give us ways to look at that. Now we think about China with the post-COVID recovery, and the post-COVID recovery is not going as fast as the Chinese had hoped. Well, now we can take those numbers, look back and say, what does this do for China's Belt and Road Initiative, for the financing that it's able to push out through that, for where it can and can't put its prioritization, for how much money it puts on economic development to the west versus how much money it puts on its maritime and naval capabilities to the east, and what are the tools that China may employ that are low cost, high benefit to give China that national strategic security place that it has. So I know that's really fast, but that's where those frameworks, building those frameworks becomes very useful. That also allows us to triage the flow of information. We are overwhelmed with information today. When I started in this field, it was about what could you find? Today, it's about how much can you get rid of so that you're not overwhelmed with information. And AI does not necessarily always help us with that. We think we just need more. We're pushing more and more towards trying to build Harry Seldon's magic box. And to do so requires even more information, and we'll never have sufficient to do that. And we'll be in that cycle. So how do you triage the flow of information? Build a framework. If the information coming in seems to match my framework, I ignore it. If it seems to contradict my framework, I put more attention on it. I also use that information flow to constantly tweak and adjust my framework. The second piece of this is then to think about geopolitics in two ways. There is objective geopolitics, and we know nothing is truly objective, but objective geopolitics is trying to look from the outside in and say, what are the likely impacts and implications of these dynamics? And then there's perceptive geopolitics. Perceptive geopolitics is how decision makers see things. We don't like to think about perceptive geopolitics. One of the problems with realist foreign policy is realism assumes and asserts everybody thinks in the same way. And we know inherently they do not. If everybody thought in the same way, all actions would be predictable. And all actions are not predictable. Everyone is constantly surprised by other people's actions. Perception of leadership is very important. Some of that comes through leadership analysis and understanding the individuals. Where were they educated? What was the frame of reference from which they grew up? What was the world in which they lived in? Who are the people who influenced them? And some of that is organizational and structural. What is the form of government? How does government actually work within their space? What are the influence groups within and outside of government? Where is power and how can it be exerted and how can it be exerted? And how do each of those influence the way in which things are seen? Sometimes perceptive geopolitics can be used as a tool to reshape a country's vision. If I look at old maps of China, the old map of China was a horizontal map of China, and the South China Sea was an inset box over to the side. China now uses a vertical map of China where the South China Sea is integral to China. Therefore, it's not something far away. If you think about the United States, US maps have Alaska and Hawaii as little tiny boxes stuck down in a corner. Alaska stretches across the entire continent of the United States. It is a massive geography, but US maps do not give the US population or even strategic thinkers a perception of Alaska and the US Arctic frontier. The same could be said for thinking about the US as a 4-ocean nation rather than a 2-ocean nation. If you change the map and change the way you view it, you recognize that the United States has an Atlantic coast, a Pacific coast, a Southern Caribbean coast, and a Northern Arctic coast. And that changes the way of thinking about vulnerabilities and strengths for the United States. The Chinese also have a different map of the world that they're using that shifts the perspective, belittles the role of the United States in the mindset, and reintegrates what Mackinder used to call the world island, the idea that if you could integrate the natural resources, the population, and the productive capacity of Africa, Europe, and Asia, you dominate the entire world. And so sometimes you use these perceptive tools to shape your society and keep them informed. Sometimes it is a lingering idea. A Russian perspective of the world sees vulnerability all the way out to the Carpathian Mountains, the Caucasus Mountains, the Tian Shan Mountains, out to the Pacific coast, and all the way across. Well, where does Ukraine fit within that perception? Ukraine is a vulnerability. And that vulnerability was reinforced to the Russians when they had the Wagner group rebel, and in a day and a half was halfway from Ukraine to Moscow, and nothing stopped it. From a Russian perspective, there's no barrier once Ukraine falls to lose Moscow. And therefore, well, the West will say that perception is illegitimate, or you shouldn't think that way, or it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how we choose to perceive it. How the Russian leadership perceives it will shape their decision making. And so if we can better understand their perceptions, we'll understand their decisions. If we build frameworks and models, we'll better understand the impact and implication of those decisions. So a Russian view of being a small space and then being a large space, that plays into their psyche. They look at the expansion of NATO. NATO's perception of the expansion of NATO is it's natural these countries volunteered and wanted to join. That's okay. That's an accurate perception. But the Russian perception, nonetheless, is also an accurate perception. This is a steady eastward movement and encircling movement of Russia by NATO, a NATO alliance that was effectively established and designed to constrain and contain Russia and the Soviet Union. Both are accurate perceptions. They are opposite perceptions, and therefore the way those perceptions are seen will shape the way in which policy responses will come. And it's why, by the way, in geopolitical dynamics, there are often no elegant solutions. Often things are irresolvable, and that is the nature of international relations. So think about the expansion of NATO into the north now. Think about the way Russia is containing eastern Ukraine. Russia doesn't want to give up eastern Ukraine. They don't want to give up Crimea. Crimea gives them Black Sea access. That's still key to their access to the Mediterranean. They lose that, they lose access to the Mediterranean. Russia has mixed relations with Turkey. They want to keep that space open. It's highly unlikely for Russia to push back. If we think about an end to the Ukrainian conflict, well, Russia could probably be comfortable ending the conflict with the geography they currently hold. Ukraine cannot, because Ukraine cannot accept Russia up against the river, because that basically ends Ukraine's ability to use the Black Sea as a key export. So Russia can't accept not being up against the river, and therefore there's no elegant solution where both sides can be comfortable and confident. And you get into a long-term conflict or a moment until somebody creates a fait accompli for the other, and somebody forces themselves to trade away certain significant assets. When we think about the Baltic, we need to be thinking about the Baltic in the concept both of the expansion of NATO, of now the closing off potentially of the Baltic to Russia. Well, how does Russia reinforce Kaliningrad? By sea primarily. Why is the Baltic so important? Because that's the access from Petersburg. Yes, Russia can push some more north to Murmansk and up through the Arctic, but this area, this Baltic area, is still a key maritime access for the Russians. It's now entirely a NATO sea. That closes the Russians in. It also has linked Northern Europe and the Baltic to the Arctic dynamics for the Russians. So we have to think about that. A final piece as we think about that Arctic dynamic is back in 2007, 2008, the Russians recognized that climate change was creating both a massive opportunity for Russia along their Arctic frontier and a huge vulnerability. And so they started rebuilding all of their military infrastructure along the Arctic North. Russia now has one of the longest exposed unsecured coastlines on the face of the planet, where in the past, for almost all of Russian history, that was a protected wall. Russia is now entirely vulnerable to maritime incursion from the north, and they don't have that space secured. At the same time, it opens up Russia's access to be able to, and Central Asia's access to move goods by sea and by river up to Russian ports in the north and actually get them out into international markets. So these concepts start to be linked in the way in which those perceptions happen, and perceptions can see both vulnerabilities and they can see opportunities. So I want to jump to next and talk about strategic scenarios. And we've heard in some ways a lot of talk about scenarios already today in different ways. Scenarios are particularly valuable for a few reasons. Number one is to take the pulse of assumptions within an organization across business units and business functions. Very often, people will initially state something that sounds very similar to what other people are stating, but in fact, they mean it in very different ways. So how do we expose differences in assumptions within an organization that are shaping the way in which they are defining their actions, they're recognizing risk, planning mitigation strategies? We first have to make those explicit. The process of building plausible futures and building scenarios is a process that starts with forcing the participants to be explicit with their assumptions, to be explicit with how they think the world is working, how they think the world is going, what they think are the core driving forces that ultimately shape behavior or action that is going to come back and have an impact. The second that is, it forces us to simplify. I know that with technology, we're constantly looking to find ways to become even more complex and integrate more and more and more and more factors. But sometimes we have to simplify. Our minds can't hold 400 and 500 variables simultaneously. We can hold about 5 to 7 variables simultaneously. We know that in oversimplifying that we are going to have some faults, but also in simplifying, we say, well, what actually is critical and what is only partially impactful? Not every input has an equal weight. If we put them all as having equal weight, we're going to spend all of our time looking at everything equally. Well, we know that there is a limitation of time and a limitation of resources. And therefore, by prioritizing focal areas, we can prioritize the use of our time and resources while not fully ignoring those others for the anomalies that may come in that may prove us wrong or may force us to reassess and reprioritize. let's go and think about a scenario on China-Taiwan. Now, the most common scenario I'm asked to build on China and Taiwan is, will China invade Taiwan and what does it mean? And I constantly push back and say, you know what, by the time China invades Taiwan and what does it mean, there are no mitigation strategies for that. We've shifted into a whole new world where everybody is undermined. Where you should focus is, what are the likely scenarios shy of invasion that are going to be evolving or likely to evolve over the next 5 to 10 years? And what do those scenarios do? Because are there scenarios that will have a big impact on reliability of supply chains that don't involve the full invasion of Taiwan? Yeah, you get the full invasion of Taiwan, you cut TSMC off from the world. Okay, everybody's hit by that. And we already know that we're 10, 15 years behind on building the infrastructure to be able to account for that. Everybody's hit, everybody has to eat it simultaneously. But are there other things that can happen shy of that? So as we look at Taiwan and building a Taiwan scenario, we first have to understand, why would China invade Taiwan? There is often an assertion that China wants to invade Taiwan. And I think that's a false assertion. China wants Taiwan reintegrated into China. They want that for multiple reasons. They want to make sure Taiwan is not a bastion of a foreign power, certainly. They want the economic capacity of Taiwan and the technological capacity, yes. They want security in their foreign waters, their near abroad waters, certainly. There are lots of things. But war is a tool, not a goal. Russia did not invade Ukraine because they wanted to invade Ukraine. They invaded Ukraine to secure what they saw as a vulnerable southwestern frontier. Military action is a tool. In the Chinese case, if we consider military action a tool rather than a goal, we can then say, what are the things that would drive them to utilize that tool? What are other tools they have in their toolkit that they could utilize to achieve their goals? And what are the specific goals that China has in regard to Taiwan? And what may change the timing or the space that they feel they have to address or adapt to changes that may suddenly take something they thought they had more time for and shrink it. Taiwan sits at a critical location on the Chinese maritime frontier. It cuts China in half. It cuts northern China and southern China in half. If China is able to control Taiwan, and you think about all the trade flow that goes through the Taiwan Strait, China effectively has the ability to dictate the trade flows for South Korea and Japan. They can fundamentally alter the political realities for South Korea and Japan, the security, strategic, and economic realities. That secures China in their region. They do not want foreign power influence in their region. How did the United States think about the Zimmerman telegraph? They really didn't like it, right? Well, how would China think about a US-dominated Korea and Japan sitting right off their coast? They really don't like that. How can they constrain and cut that? They need to be able to control the economic leads and the economic paths to those countries to shape that. If China controls Taiwan, they bust through the US double arc that constrains China into the Western Pacific, and they can move out further into the Pacific space. If a foreign power controls Taiwan, they are able to utilize Taiwan to cut the Taiwanese Navy in half, to limit Taiwanese economic activity, and to constrain Taiwanese trade internationally, potentially. All right. So this is a structural, strategic issue, not just an issue of, oh, we had 100 years of humiliation. Oh, there are compatriots who want it back. Oh, I want to finish Mao's great victory or something like that. So think about Taiwan in those dynamics. Then we can look and say, well, what are the tools available? What are the likely tools China is going to have? And as we build different scenarios, we then are forced to say, what are the forward-looking, someone brought this up already, what are the forward-looking indicators that I can see that will tell me that China is moving more, fulfilling one scenario versus another? And as I track those forward-leading indicators, I can start to have greater or lesser confidence. I can wipe out scenarios. I can force myself to rewrite them. Don't hold these scenarios forever. They're constantly tweaking and changing. Remember, we've overly simplified the inputs in them, but they give me ways to think about that. I also use the scenarios to go back and tell different parts of my organization, let's assume that this scenario is accurate 5 years from now, and this is the reality. Don't argue whether it is or isn't, whether it's plausible or not plausible. What are the impacts or implication for your slice of the organization if this is true? And what we often find working with companies is that the impacts and implications are different for different slices of the company. And they're not communicating across to each other entirely why those impacts are different and are perceived then as more or less significant. And so this helps you do that and then run through the mitigation strategies. And in doing so, it may expose places where, okay, we have a vulnerability to subcomponent X. Are there 2 or 3 other potential suppliers for that subcomponent that are largely outside of this geographic space or this political space? And can I at least start to build relationships with them so if I do get to a trigger point, I'm able to move faster than my competitors to turn that on? Because we know as soon as you shut off supply in one place, everybody is going to go to that other place. So how do you get yourself in identifying it early, make the relationships, already start building that capacity, and be able to identify it? And the same will go for thinking about routes. And then we can start looking at indicators. So what changes China's perception of whether economics is a viable tool of coercion or enticement versus military as a coercive tool? Well, one of the things is, how do the Taiwanese view themselves? And you can track Taiwanese sentiment indices. It's not just from an election. These sentiment indices run for a long period of time. And one of the problems China has is demographically, as Taiwan continues to have new people born in Taiwan, they think less and less of themselves as being Chinese. And so the place for enticement shrinks, the place for political and social affinity shrinks. And as China's economy reaches a natural peak for a fast-growing economy to a stabilizing economy, it's harder for China to say, oh, you need China, you must tie into China. Therefore, some of the things that China thought in the past that gave them more time, why was Deng able to say, bide your time, and Xi no longer is that the security dynamic in the region is changing, the economic dynamic is changing, but in particular, the social dynamic in Taiwan is changing, and bide your time may no longer be a viable strategy. And that reduces the ability of China to use economic enticement and leaves them only with harder coercive tools. And we know that those harder coercive tools often have less effectiveness in endearing someone to you and create more stress internationally. These same things can be used, scenarios can be used with state actors, but they can be used with non-state actors. So thinking about the relationship between the various militant actors in the Sahel, the governments in the Sahel, and the European and the American governments, and watching those changes and how those dynamics change will help us think about that. And then after doing so, we can then re-look at our frameworks and say, what does this mean for security regionally? What does this mean for spillover effects? What does this mean for broader ability to monitor or see security dynamics? What does it mean for France in regards to losing the Sahel, but shifting their focus to the Indo-Pacific and now having to deal with New Caledonia? And then we can build scenarios in different spaces and look at the way they interact or interchange with each other. So thinking about a scenario on US tech and economic policy and sanction policy on China, and a scenario that we build separately on thinking about the way in which the EU adapts to a multipolar world, well, by default, those are going to influence each other. And we can start looking at these scenarios and saying, can I map them against each other, see where they start to push and play with each other? And interesting things can happen as you do that. And the pattern in one scenario can help you better define and change and alter within another scenario that you're working with. Okay, so before we get into Q&A, I want to pull this down and say, how do we use this when we go into the tactical? Because one of the challenges, as much as everybody wants to think strategically and wants to think long-term and thinks that they do, is we're all caught in the tyranny of the immediate. Everything is about the now. Everything is the minor tweak in the headline, and everybody's freaking out about that and coming back and saying, hey, what does this mean? What does this mean? What does this mean? Number one, if you do not have a broad set of geopolitical frameworks built out, build that context, then you are heavily vulnerable to information volatility. That the information VIX is all over the place, particularly as we look at divisive media and split media and the way in which society is pulling things in different ways. Information volatility is huge. How do you understand things and not be constantly caught in that? As you think about scenarios and building out scenarios, how does the information challenge the scenario, or does it fit within the scenario? And again, if it fits within the scenario, you can largely ignore it. If it challenges the scenario, you can put more attention to it and then decide if you have to tweak the scenario. And then think about, as we think about all of this tactical flow of events and information and things, impact and implications have to be agnostic. We can't think of them in terms of what would I like to see, what would I politically prefer, what would I business-wise prefer. Step back and say, what does it mean? And then I can go in and say, now, if I want to achieve goal X or goal Y or goal Z, what would I need to do to get there if this is the reality? Not, let me keep thinking that I wish everybody else wants to go the same way I go, and so I'm just going to pretend and assume. And I have worked with companies that have literally said, the China-Taiwan dynamic is too complex, the semiconductors are too important, we're just not even going to look at that and just ignore it. Wishful thinking, right? Or organizations that are still operating at the core on ideas that they framed in 1989 or 1997 and have never looked to adjust or adapt them to changing realities, and those become there. So if we put Israel and Gaza in conflict, yes, we have the tactical dynamics, and yes, we have the tactical dynamics on personnel security and both inside the region and outside the region, right? The play over into the way in which we see it play out in US or European universities, the potential change in the way in which the Europeans focus on ESG issues regarding Israel versus the way in which the United States focuses on that. We'll put it in the context of Europe and European social norms, European political norms and political direction, put it in the context of the US, and then think about where that fits and where these pressures are going to be stronger or weaker, where the forces are going to be pushing and pulling against them. What are the ways in which those outside dynamics play back into domestic Israeli politics, and how does that shape Israeli policy, particularly not just as we think about the evolution of Gaza, but the potential challenges in a future expansion to Lebanon? And then put it also in the context, when you think about US policy, for example, US policy about Israel is not merely about Israel. It's about Saudi Arabia. It's about a broader regional policy in regards to Iran. Well, if it's a regional policy in regards to Iran, the US wants to find a way for this to resolve in a way that Saudi and Israel continue to normalize. But we also now need to think about a helicopter crash in Iran in relationship to what's happening in Israel and that broader dynamic of the shift in the Middle East balance and structure, particularly outside of a Cold War architecture. We think about a North Korea, right? Well, what is North Korea doing? Well, North Korea has focused for several years on more tactical systems rather than strategic systems. And it's done so to give itself a huge number of options on the Korean Peninsula besides total destruction of the peninsula or nothing. That means that the space for escalation in the Korean Peninsula is much higher than it used to be. The North Koreans have disavowed any plan for unification. That changes the way, perhaps, in which they may or may not be willing to see destruction of certain assets in the South. But it also reduces, perhaps, the desire of the North Koreans to take action. It's not necessarily driving them to attack or invade the South. if unification is not their goal. And quite frankly, I think that's built more off of the idea that they didn't anticipate it was possible or plausible. We can think about then, though, that drive that the North Koreans had to change their ability to alter the escalation ladder on the Korean Peninsula created a really interesting opportunity for them when Russia started running out of artillery shells in Ukraine. And now we see North Korea tied very strongly back economically into Russia. And that has compelled the Chinese to try to re-ingratiate themselves to the North Koreans. And the North Koreans haven't liked the Chinese for a while. And now the North Koreans have a whole lot of new options that they did not have 5 years ago. And so we want to start thinking about what that means and look at what it means for South Korea, as the South Koreans are looking at, playing up the idea of being heavily integrated into the United States security architecture. Well, that puts them economically at risk with China. That puts them socially at risk domestically because of the change in policy toward Japan. If there's a change in the US administration, do they find themselves out left hanging? And then think about, supply chains from a sense of international choke points or critical commodities or critical trade items that everybody is looking at and everybody is dependent upon. And we can put them again in the context. Why does Yemen target the Gulf? Because that's the place they have to target the Gulf. That's their way of interacting with the Israeli conflict and demonstrating who they are and what they are and where they get their influence. Who's going in there to act and who's not? How are the Chinese interacting? Very differently than they did in counter-piracy actions, for example. But what are the lessons that we can take from here for other potential geographic choke points? What are the vulnerabilities? What are the secondary or tertiary routes that may start to be used? And as we look at these also, what's the second and third order delays that may happen? Because a delayed ship doesn't just delay that cargo. A delayed ship has ripple further and further down the road because that ship is running fewer runs over the same amount of time, which means it's not just that load of cargo, it backs up and backs up and backs up. Then you add the stress of not enough water in the Panama Canal. Then you add, if you get another Evergrande blocking the Suez Canal, these sort of unexpected moments compound this dynamic. So how do we look at these tactical issues through traditional intelligence analysis, but also through framing them in that broad geopolitical framework and in our scenarios to understand both using those scenarios to better understand the dynamics driving the tactical situation, but also how do these tactical situations ripple out further and further into those broader areas? And I think with that, I'm going to stop the slide presentation and open us up to Q&A.
Roger, thank you very much. This is Chris Denning. I am the Chief Security Officer at the Global Resilience Federation. I also lead our Business Resilience Council. So it's our pleasure to have you here. I will say I respect RANE a lot, and now I see where a lot of RANE/Stratfor's expert analysis comes from. So thank you for being here. Appreciate it. And I had just a lot of questions I wrote down that I could ask you, but I feel it's probably most appropriate to start with the questions that our audience asked you, and maybe some future date we'll get together again and I can ask you some of the ones I've saved up. So the first question I think is probably an easy one. He asks, or he or she asks, where would you recommend one get more information on impacts associated with Taiwan scenarios for planning purposes?
Yeah, I mean, so some of it is going to say, what's your business, what's your organization, and what's your vulnerability to Taiwan? It's one thing if you have personnel there. It's another thing if you're only vulnerable to a particular chip that's primarily coming out of Taiwan or things of that sort. I mean, so that will define where you're going to get your information for those scenarios. It may be going and digging in through databases down 4, 5, 6 SITC codes to try to see where the critical node is that's going to play back in. Some of it may be looking at other organizations that have already been putting out a lot of these scenarios. The US government, US military, think tanks are putting out all sorts of very interesting scenarios. And definitely don't limit yourself to those coming out of the United States, because some of the stuff coming out of Japan, for example, is highly nuanced. and they're much more cognizant of some of these aspects as others. And then there are organizations out there that can assist you in building these out. But to me, the first question is, have you defined what your potential vulnerabilities are, what your relationship is, and then that'll help define where you're going to get your key information to be able to follow up on that.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Roger. The next question is very interesting to me. I had not considered it yet before, but I think this is a type of question we need to be asking ourselves. It says, "Hi, Roger," and this is from Bruce Smithhammer. He asks, "How do you currently assess the value of generative AI in predictive analysis? Have you personally found it helpful, or just something that needs to be independently verified anyway, and therefore limited in value?"
So I use generative AI as if it is another analyst on my team. And I use it to try to test and challenge, to try to find things or come up with ideas that perhaps I had not thought of in what I'm doing. I will say that, even when we try to run really complex queries against it, it's often coming up with things that we would anticipate. That's one of the challenges with it. A lot of it is dependent upon what data set it has or things like that. But it can be a very valuable tool, not to do the work, but I would argue, at least right now in this phase, to be part of the red team or part of the alternative analysis approach, or a place to make sure you're not missing something. And when we build scenario teams or forecast teams or anything like that, we always try to bring in a combination of thematic people, geographic people, and then one or two non-experts from that particular concept that we're playing with, who ask the stupid questions, because the stupid questions are often the ones that are catching us on assumptions that we're making that have become that have turned into facts in our heads, but have always been sitting there as assumptions that we've just been right for so long we don't bother rechecking them. And AI comes in and plays that role really, really well. And then the other thing I use it for, and this may go back to the first question, I use AI a lot to query, where can I find particular types of information? What are the sources of information? So AI doesn't tell us where it gets its information, but you can actually query back and ask it where that information could be found, who would possess it. And one of the biggest questions that, since the invention of the Google box, that everybody forgets to do, instead of saying, find me the information, we should be saying, where would that information be, so that I can make sure I'm getting the best information possible to fit into my models, into my planning, into my predictions, into my analysis and my assessment.
Roger, that was excellent. I honestly, insights there that I had never thought of. Um, Very good to add that to our tool set. So I'm going to ask one of my own questions, and this will probably be the last one. Now, it's a little bit long. I think you can handle it. So the first part of it is, like more of a statement. We did an exercise in 2023 that examined what would happen if China were to disrupt Taiwan's supply chain in any way, whether it be war, would it be a blockade, some other way. Most participants, and we had, I think it was about 80 organizations. We did this exercise twice, and these organizations came from literally every sector: financial, communications, manufacturing, you name it. Banking was another big one. But most participants indicated that they knew they needed to diversify, not just away from Taiwan, but also away from China. Because, of course, we're going to see sanctions, massive sanctions, just like we saw against Russia when they invaded Ukraine. Perhaps bigger sanctions, given how much China is involved with. Companies know they need to diversify, but outside of a scenario where they are federally provided incentives to do so, like, we'll say, the 2022 CHIPS Act, what would motivate Western governments or companies to diversify or decouple from China absent that kind of support?
So I think the idea of decouple probably doesn't happen for most, unless they're basically going to say, just quote, cut their losses or things of that sort. And that does put them at risk of what happened to many companies that found themselves having forced decoupling with Russia, um, and losing their assets domestically. Um, I think it's the problem is money, right? It costs to diversify. It costs even more to decouple. And it costs, by the way, to decouple not just in money. Where am I building new factories? Do they have the same um, concentration of resources and subcomponents and everything that China does? Nobody can replace China in that concentration of varieties of services and manufacture in a single tight geographic location. Um, but it also potentially comes with other risks. If I choose to leave China, will I face pressure from Chinese citizens towards my products or goods? Will I not only lose my manufacturing in China, will I lose my market in China? Um, so those things are really big challenges. I think where it comes down to what can do it, what can force them to do it. Usually it probably is a crisis that already happened and then it's too late. But I think thinking forward, it is, are there small steps that can be taken that are not about fully duplicating supply chain, that are not about anything like that, but are there one or two critical components that I know I need to be aware of that maybe what I do is I just start stockpiling a little bit extra. I buy 2% extra every order and start sticking it away. Do things like that. We are seeing more supply chain managers moving into that C-suite and accepting the idea that resilience costs money. But in the end, until you change the incentive structure for businesses and corporations, where, even though we talk about long term, the leadership is incentivized often in very short term dynamics and quarterly reports and things of that sort. Um, they seem to be more willing to accept the idea that if a crisis occurs, they can blame it on some colorful animal um, and not be blamed for it, than potentially not have their stocks grow enough percentage in a particular time. Nobody likes to spend on insurance. Um, and I think that what's going to happen is a few more disruptive crises. And, COVID did this, the Fukushima did it, uh, Katrina did it. For some companies, we saw those being enough of a crisis to get small movements going. I think as you get critical mass in corporations and they feel that other people are doing it, then they start going along with it.
Thanks, Roger. I just add to your words of wisdom there. You did say it's all about money, right? And resources. If we can use these past examples, these past tragedies and crises to demonstrate what the cost is, then I think our companies and our government will be more likely to support that diversification that needs to happen to shore up more resilience. I think that's about all the time we have, unfortunately. Roger, we'll be in touch. But I'll turn the time over to Mark. I think, Mark, you were going to close us out here.
Sure. No, thanks, Roger. Many people gave you kudos in your analysis and insights, and couple really liked that Harry Seldon Foundation reference. But I felt like I was learning something on every slide and every word that you had. So really, really appreciate you and your time.